Welcome to week 3 of 30 Days to Understanding the Bible by Max Anders. So far, you would have learned the structure of the Bible, the way that the books are set up, and the geography of the Old Testament. Last week, you would have went over the first 4 eras of the Old Testament. And if you haven't seen that yet, go ahead and click over to the video for week 2 of 30 Days to Understanding the Bible so you can catch up with us. Now, if you are with us and you're tracking along, then I want you to pause this video right now and answer what the first 4 eras of the Bible are. Maybe even draw a map and try to trace the first 4 eras and the Old Testament story up until that 4th era. Go ahead and pause it right now and we'll be back. Okay, so if you know the first 4 eras, then you know that you have creation, patriarchs, Exodus, conquest. And I'm gonna go ahead and draw us up until where we stopped last time. So we started here in Eden with Adam. We moved our way up the river, down into Canaan with Abraham. You had Abraham, who had Isaac, who had Jacob, who was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of the brothers, Joseph, gets sold into slavery. That's how they moved down into Egypt. So Joseph is sold to slavery. He moves over into Egypt, and he moves up to second in command over all of Egypt because of the famine that's in the land. Well, because of that, the rest of the nation of Israel, about 70 people, move down into Egypt, and then they end up populating there, living there in the land of Goshen. Now, what ends up happening is Pharaoh ends up losing power, dying, and a new Pharaoh is risen up and put in place. And he does not like the Israelites. And so he ends up putting them into slavery. And that's how they end up in the Exodus era. After this, Moses is risen up by the Lord and is commanded to free the nation and take them back to the promised land. And so Moses takes them from Egypt. He says, let my people go, and they start moving up over to Mount Sinai, which is roughly right there. They get the law at Mount Sinai, and immediately they begin disobeying God. And so God tells them that they need to wander. They cross the Red Sea. They need to wander for 40 years. So I like to represent that with a squiggly line. They end up roughly here at a place called Kadesh Barnea, where the 12 spies are sent. 2 of them come back, that's Joshua and Caleb, saying, hey, we can take the land. God is with us. But 10 of them convince the nation and the people, the Hebrew people, to not go into the promised land. So God tells them they need to wander again. It is during this time that the entire generation ends up passing away, and the only 2 that are allowed into the promised land are Joshua and Caleb, and then all of the children from the previous generation. So they wander again for another 40 years, and they make their way up right here to a place called Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is when Deuteronomy is written and spoken. Moses is doing a second retelling of the law to Joshua and the rest of the people as they enter into the promised land. We ended our time last week right here in number 4. Number 4 is the conquest era. They take Jericho, they move across the land, they go south, they go north, they end up inhabiting and having dominion over the land. But God told them to have dominion over all the land. So as we walk into the next era, we're going to see where they failed. Now, the next era we get is they divide up into those 12 tribes, the sons of Jacob, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. And they divide all over this land. A couple are on this side, they're north and south, and they're all over, and they decide over each of the tribes, they're going to appoint a judge. That's why it's called the Judges era. And they're going to appoint a judge, and what they're going to do is they're going to be the rulers and govern that specific tribe. So the things that we need to know are the era is Judges, number 5, Judges. The key figure is Samson, because he's the most famous judge, the one with the long hair who gets its strength from his hair. He cuts it and he loses his strength. Samson. The key location, we're back in Canaan. We're in Canaan at number 5. And the storyline summary is this. that Samson and others are chosen as judges to govern the people for 400 rebellious years. You see, during this time, there's a cycle beginning to happen. You have a basic outline of the story is that you have judges are appointed, that's the leaders of Israel. Then you have rebellion, which is the breaking of God's law. Then you have cycles, which is the repetition of that same thing. Appointing a judge, sinning. Appointing a judge, sinning. A sin cycle. Before finally ending this period with the model woman Ruth. So Judges gets us into this sin cycle. I want you to go ahead and pause the video right now and then pick it back up while we start the next era. Pause the video, and I want you to test yourself with the self-test section of the book. Okay? Ready, set, go. Now, the next era of the book, we walk into the kingdom era. So what ends up happening is that Israel appoints their first king over all 12 tribes. His name is Saul. He reigns for 40 years. And then the kingdom is given over to David, who reigns for 40 years. Then to his son Solomon, who reigns for 40 years. So the era is the kingdom era. The key figure is David. We're still right in the same era. Same area, not era. Same area. Except now, instead of it being called Canaan, it's called Israel because they became a united nation. They are the united nation of Israel. So this is what happens. You have the sixth era is the kingdom era. You have the key figure of David. You have the location now is Israel. And you have the storyline summary of this. David, the greatest king of the new monarchy, is followed by a succession of mostly unrighteous kings, and God eventually judges Israel for her sins, sending her into an exile. This is how this section breaks up. You can read about the kingdom era from 1 Samuel all the way to 2 Chronicles, and it's going to break up like this. You're going to have the united kingdom of Israel. That's when they're all one nation. The 12 tribes are represented in this. This is in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's a new monarchy that's established. Then the kingdom divides. You have a divided kingdom. You can read about that in 1 Kings. And there's basically a big civil war happening. The kingdom divides right in the middle. The southern kingdom of Judah is established, and the northern kingdom stays under the name Israel. To read about the northern kingdom, you're going to pick up the book of 2 Kings, and you're going to start reading that. That is known as the unrighteous kingdom. Out of their 20 kings, they had 0 righteous kings. They end up getting exiled to Assyria first. Judah stays a little bit longer. The southern kingdom, which is the last part of our expansion, and that's also in 2 Kings, and that is the inconsistent kingdom because they had a few righteous kings. They had 8, and then the rest were unrighteous. They ended up being established for quite a while longer. This all leads us into the next era, but before we get into the next era, I want you to pause this video and I want you to take the self-test. And if you have a problem answering any of it, make sure you refer to your book and look at the previous pages so that you can refresh your memory. Remember, in this book, the author Max Anders tells us that repetition is the key to mental ownership. So take a second and repeat these things to yourself. Maybe even do the 5th era and 6th era all together so that you can really get a grasp on this. Okay, pause the video and come back to us right when you're done. Okay, like I said, the exile is the next era. It's the exile era. You move from 6, the kingdom era, all the way over. They get exiled to Assyria, and then Babylonia, and then Persia. So what ends up happening is this. You have the divided kingdom. The unrighteous kingdom gets defeated by Assyria. Then years later, Babylonia defeats Assyria, which is the nation of Assyria and Israel, and they take Jerusalem. Years later, Persia rises up as the greatest kingdom, and they end up conquering all of them. Assyria, Babylonia, Israel, and Judah. And so you have a huge melting pot of people in this era. This exile era can be found from the books of Ezekiel to Daniel. The era is exile. The key figure is Daniel. He's the main prophet writing during this era. The location predominantly is in Babylonia. And the storyline summary is this. Daniel gives leadership and he encourages faithfulness among the exiles for the next 70 years while they're in captivity again. Now this is how it breaks up. You guys can see the map here. They ultimately end up descending from here to Babylonia down to Persia. That's where they end up by the end of these books. And what happens is when they're in Persia, a king has a softened heart to the Israelite people. His name's Cyrus. But before we get there, let's talk about the expansion of these books and where to kind of see all of this unfold in the Bible. So you have 4 main expansion points. Like every era, we have 4 main expansion points. The first is the prophecy. You can find that in all of the prophetic books, but mainly in Jeremiah is the focus. Jeremiah is warning of an impending captivity. He's telling these people here, do not continue doing what you're doing because you're going to get captured. They obviously don't listen. We know the story. We know that they get captured. The second breakout expansion point is prophets. This is Ezekiel to Daniel. The prophets are all about encouraging the faithfulness of the exiles while they're in exile. Then the third breakout is exiles. You can find this in Daniel. This is the exiled people assimilating to their new culture. And then the very fourth thing is power change. Now this is where we left off, in Persia. The Persian Empire begins to expand, and because they're expanding, they begin to rule and start conquering other neighboring big nations. Well, like I said, Cyrus ends up taking over, and he's who allows the next era to take place. So before we get into the next era, I don't want to confuse you. I want you to pause this video, take the self-test, practice the eras from 5 through 7 now. Remember, repetition is the key to mental ownership, as the author Max Anders says. So pause the video, take the self-test, and start it right back up when you're finished. Okay, so we're now at chapter 11 in the book. We're on to the 8th era. We're almost done with the Old Testament here. And pretty soon you're going to be able to recreate this map on your own and walk someone else through the entire Old Testament story in a condensed version. So chapter 11 tells us all about the return era. Like I said, the king of Persia, Cyrus, has a softened heart. What ends up happening during the return, which is the name of the era, is you have this key figure, Ezra. That's the main prophet writing during this period. You have the location is now Jerusalem. So they end up here during the 7th era. They move down to Persia when Persia conquers, and then they slowly get sent back in waves. They get sent back in 3 waves by the king all the way back to Jerusalem. That's where their temple was. So when they were first exiled, their temple was destroyed by the Assyrians and Babylonians. And so King Cyrus, he has a softened heart and he starts sending people back. Okay? This is a storyline summary of this era. Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild their capital, Jerusalem. Here's how it expands. You have disrepair, which is from Nehemiah 1, verse 1 to 3. That's the destruction from war and neglect. Nehemiah reminds us of what happened. Then you have the rebuilding of the temple. They went back and they rebuilt the temple in Ezra 1 to 6. Then the third part is you have the rebuilding of the people. That's from Ezra 7 to 10. This is a spiritual rebuilding that's happening in the people of Israel. Then you have the rebuilding of the walls. This is the famous story of Nehemiah, rebuilding the walls and restoring the capital again. So let me remind you of the storyline summary. Ezra, he leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem, and you find this from Ezra to Esther. We're back in Jerusalem now with a rebuilt people, a rebuilt temple, and a rebuilt city. Go ahead and take the self-test before we walk into the very last era of the Old Testament. And then when we finish that, I'm going to give you an assignment to do before we go into next week's poetical and prophetical books. Okay, now we're back. The Silence Era. This is the 9th and last era of the Old Testament. We're going to have 3 more eras when we get to the New Testament. But the Silence Era happens between the Old and New Testaments. There's a 400-year gap of silence that is taking place. The key figure is the Pharisees. They're rising up as the religious leaders of the time. The location is in Jerusalem because remember, we got back to Jerusalem after the 8th era when Cyrus sent us back to rebuild the people, the walls, and the temple. Now, the storyline summary is this. Pharisees and others entomb the Israelites in legalism for the next 400 years in between the Testaments. Here's the expansion of it. You have the changing of the guard, which in the book you'll see relates to the March of Nations. You have political sects rising up. That's the Maccabees and the Zealots. You have the religious sects rising up. That's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then you have the ending of that era of messianic hope. They are expecting a Savior to come. So we end in Jerusalem, right here. And the Old Testament ends just how it began, with an anticipation for the Messiah to come and bring hope and salvation to the people. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take the self-test, pause and take the self-test, and then I'm going to give you a quick homework assignment. And it should be fairly easy if you've been following along, but it should challenge you a little bit. Remember, repetition is the key to mental ownership. Okay, now that you've paused the video and you're back, this is what I want you to do. I want you to get a sheet of paper. It can be lined, it can be blank. Blank is probably better. I want you to trace the map out of your book. If you don't have a book, trace the water features, Mediterranean, Nile, Red Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan, Dead Sea, Euphrates, Tigris, Persian Gulf, and trace the key locations. You have Egypt, you have Israel, Canaan, Jerusalem, Persia, Eden, Babylonia, Syria. Make sure that you draw the map. Then what I want you to do is I want you to write down next to the drawn map all 9 eras of the Old Testament. Write out all of the key figures. Write out all of the key locations. Write out all of the storyline summaries. And the last thing I want you to do after you get all that, if you can get all that, this next part is easy. If you can't, make sure you go back to those chapters because we don't want to miss this. What I want you to do after all of that is I want you to do exactly what we've been doing on the map. I want you to trace from the first era, the story of the Old Testament, all the way from Eden up to Ur to Haran, down to Canaan, over to Egypt with Moses freeing the people, into Kadesh Barnea and Mount Nebo, over to Canaan again before being called Israel and separating to Judah and moving into Assyria, down Babylonia and Persia, back over to Jerusalem and ending the story. I want you guys to do this. And if you have a sibling, or if you have a child, or if you have a parent, or you have somebody in your life, a friend, I want you to walk them through it as best as you can so that you can start feeling confidence as you reteach this to other people in your life. Join us next week. We're going to be talking straight through the poetical and prophetical books to cap out our section 1 of the entire Bible, which is the Old Testament itself. We'll see you then.